On today's episode, I'll go over Anders Sorensen's expectations and Kevin Korchinski getting recalled.
You're Locked On Blackhawks, your daily podcast on the Chicago Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Locked On Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Real quick, do me a favor, go and hit that like button. Jump in the comment section down below as well with your Mailbag Monday question. Of course, won't be able to get to it on today's episode, but we'll make sure to stash it for this time next week. Go and subscribe to Locked On Blackhawks on YouTube as well. Really closing in on my goal of 2,000 subscribers, and hitting that subscribe button won't cost you anything, is absolutely 100% free. And last but certainly not least, do got to give a shout out to today's sponsor, which is Game Time. If you're not already a member, go and download the Game Time app and use the code LOCKEDONNHL in all caps. That way, you can get $20 off to the sporting events, concerts, or theater events near you. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Again, thank you all for joining me on another episode of Locked On Blackhawks, your one-stop shop for all things Chicago Blackhawks. And when it rains, it pours, Blackhawks fans. Is following the team's fifth consecutive loss on Saturday afternoon to the Winnipeg Jets, falling 4-2. We learned that Petr Mrazek, who of course was banged up during the midway point of that game, Arvid Soderblom had to come on in relief, is dealing with a groin injury and is set to miss some time after being placed on injured reserve. Alec Martinez, who has been banged up countless times already here through the opening 27 games, did manage to score his first goal as a member of the Blackhawks on Saturday against the Jets, only to take a puck to the face later on in the game. He's now set to miss some time as well, and as a result, the Blackhawks have had to recall goaltender Drew Commesso once again, as well as defenseman Kevin Korchinski, the 2022 7th overall pick from the Rockford IceHogs. Let's start with Korchinski in the situation with Alec Martinez. Fortunately, seems like Martinez and the Hawks have avoided any long-term damage with that puck to the face scary situation on Saturday afternoon. Martinez has been diagnosed as day-to-day at this point in time, so doesn't seem like he's going to be missing a significant stretch of hockey, which is good news, and I think that is also reflected in the decision for the Blackhawks to call up Kevin Korchinski, because I think if this was going to be a long-term absence for Martinez, they would have elected to call up someone who I think provides a little bit more stability to the NHL level right here, right now. Someone like an Isaac Phillips, I think, would have been an ideal candidate. But because Martinez is only expected to miss probably a week or two, I would have to guess, I think this makes sense to call up Kevin Korchinski in a brief little stint to see how he's kind of developed thus far down in the AHL with the Rockford IceHogs. And Korchinski, he's played in 21 AHL games so far this season, tallying 11 points, 2 goals, and 9 assists, getting opportunities in all situations for Rockford, manning the top power play unit, continuing to hone his craft there, while also continuing to physically mature and shore up some of his deficiencies on the defensive side of things. And regardless if Kevin Korchinski looks like he's made a leap since we last saw him at the NHL level last year, in which he played 76 games as a 19-year-old, the youngest defenseman in the NHL. And in hindsight, the Blackhawks probably should have let him continue to marinate with the Seattle Thunderbirds in the WHL. Hindsight always 2020 though, but regardless if this goes good or bad for Kevin Korchinski, somewhere in the middle, ultimately I do think the Blackhawks are going to be sending him back down to Rockford. The plan isn't going to change whatsoever, even though things have obviously been shuffled up at the big league level. Korchinski, they still want to let him continue to develop down in Rockford, only 20 years old, not going to turn 21 until the end of the season later on in the summer in June, so still very early in the developmental process, and I'm sure Kyle Davidson and the front office do not want him to be feeling like he's underwater at the NHL level like he did last year. So I think this is just an opportunity for Korchinski to show the front office and show the coaching staff how he's kind of developed and evolved his game through 21 contests down at the AHL level. And regardless of how it goes, they're going to return him back to Rockford to let him continue on that process. But I do think it is a good opportunity for Kevin Korchinski to get in some NHL games, as long as they're very open with the communication about what is the purpose of this stint. I hope they're kind of communicating with him, at least from afar. This seems to be the plan that, hey, you're going to go back down to Rockford regardless. Don't feel like you have a lot of pressure on your shoulders to go and perform right here, right now. Because listen, even if you perform well, kid, we're going to send you back down to Rockford. So just go out there, play free, play confident, play aggressive, and let some of that skating and puck handling ability be on display, because the Blackhawks have been desperately missing that from their back end. And Kevin Korchinski and his wheels and his game could be a nice boost for a few contests on the Blackhawks back end. So excited to see how many games of action he's going to wind up getting into the lineup, and also how he's going to fare in those games. Jumping over to Petr Mrazek, who had to leave during the midway point of Saturday's game against the Jets. Saw him talking to the Blackhawks coaching staff, and then during the midst of a play, had to be blown dead because Mrazek was clearly banged up. Soderblom had to come on in relief, and then we found out after the game, or the following morning, that Mrazek is dealing with a left groin injury and has been placed on injured reserve. Fortunately, just like Alec Martinez, feels like the Blackhawks have dodged a bullet here, and Mrazek is only expected to miss about a week or two, but they still did have to recall Drew Commesso once again here from Rockford, which I'm sure has also played an impact into him not having the best start to his sophomore campaign with the IceHogs. Commesso is 4-6-0 through 10 appearances with a 3.34 goals against, .897 save percentage in 10 appearances. But I think kind of like Arvid Soderblom last year, with a young goaltender who's not getting consistent action in one place, is having to be called up and down as a result of all the injuries in between the pipes at the NHL level. I'm sure that has to play at least a little part in Drew Comesso's numbers not taking a leap like we would have wanted after a strong first year at the pro scene. This time, though, does feel like Drew Commesso, there is a chance that he could make his NHL debut, because, as I mentioned, the 1 to 2 week timeline for Petr Mrazek and the Blackhawks have a back-to-back this upcoming weekend as they'll wrap up their 3-game East Coast road trip against the New Jersey Devils on Saturday, 12 p.m. Central Time. Puck drop, by the way, before they turn things around and return to the United Center to play the New York Islanders for the second time in 4 days at the UC. Gotta figure Arvid Soderblom isn't going to start both of those games for the Blackhawks, so I'd imagine Drew Commesso is going to make his NHL debut. I think this is the third or fourth time he's already had to be recalled from Rockford here on the season, but probably the first time we're actually going to see him in game action. For Mrazek, though, it is a concerning injury, even though he's only out 1 to 2 weeks. At least that's the timeline as of now, because if you've been following along with Petr Mrazek's career trajectory and his timeline, he dealt with groin injuries the 2 previous seasons before coming to Chicago, and those injuries kept him off the ice for a majority of both of those campaigns. Since coming to Chicago, he's managed to stay healthy and avoid that nagging and plaguing groin injury. But now, of course, that is the issue that he's dealing with. Hopefully it's not something that lingers, and hopefully he can get back to being fully healthy pretty soon. I think it was a little obvious based on the dip in his play the last few weeks that he was kind of dealing with something, and also probably was starting to get a bit exhausted based on the amount of starts and how much he was having to be utilized by the Blackhawks early on in the season. Last but certainly not least, last roster news that I wanted to get to on today's episode, Joey Anderson was placed on waivers by the Blackhawks on Sunday afternoon for the purpose of sending him to the Rockford IceHogs of the AHL, but there was some concern that Anderson would be claimed by another club. That didn't end up happening, though, is just about 30 minutes ago. Actually, the reason why I waited to get today's episode out until later on in the afternoon. I wanted to hear if Joey Anderson was going to clear waivers. He did, but the Blackhawks, interestingly enough, have not assigned him to the Rockford IceHogs just as of yet. And they do have 30 days ultimately to send Anderson to Rockford. If they don't send him to Rockford during that 30-day time window, then they'll have to place him through waivers again. But the reason why I waited until this afternoon to get an episode out is because there were some rumblings that should Joey Anderson clear waivers, the Blackhawks could be calling up top prospect Frank Nazar here this afternoon. That didn't ultimately end up happening, and we also got a little bit of insight from Emily Kaplan about a potential Frank Nazar call-up. Kaplan posted on Twitter literally 30 minutes ago saying, for the Blackhawks fans wondering when they might see top prospect Frank Nazar in the NHL, ... Not imminent, but we're getting close. Chicago wants its prospects to over-ripen in the AHL. Again, term we've heard a lot with Blackhawks prospects. I believe the initial call-up plan for Nazar was later this season, but the timeline has moved up because of how well he's been playing in Rockford. For those of you who have been living under a rock, Nazar has been fantastic for the IceHogs so far in his first pro season. 24 points, 11 goals, 13 assists in his first 20 games, leading point scorer on the team, 6th in the AHL among all players and points, 1st in rookie scoring. He's been absolutely lighting it up, and because of this production and consistency in the play driving, some folks have been wondering, has Nazar's timeline been kind of bumped up? And I've even talked about it on the show multiple times here in the last couple of weeks. I mentioned a few, probably early on last week, that I think the Blackhawks should continue to be patient with Frank Nazar. Now that Anders Sorensen has stepped in as the interim and Luke Richardson has been fired, though, I do think the path for Nazar to get an NHL call-up has changed, and I do think there was some concern that, hey, if we call up someone like a Frank Nazar and continue to play Luke Richardson's style and under his system, there are some worries about his lack of production, a lack in confidence then as a result, and then it's kind of turns into a tumbleweed effect a la what we've seen with Lucas Reichel. We absolutely wanted to avoid that, and I think that was part of the decision ultimately why Kyle Davidson let Luke Richardson go. Now that Sorensen is in the mix, of course, he's familiar with Nazar from his time down in Rockford early on this year in the last couple of development camps. I think there is a greater chance or a greater likelihood that Frank Nazar gets called up ahead of schedule. As we heard from Emily Kaplan, the original plan was for him to get recalled somewhere in the latter half of the season. When I last talked about this, I guessed early February, sometime right around the trade deadline. But quite honestly, if Frank Nazar keeps up at this pace, Blackhawks fans, even though they do want to over-ripen prospects, and I agree that's the right mentality, I kind of think Frank Nazar is going to force the organization's hand if he keeps up this level of productivity. So doesn't sound like it's going to be coming soon, but my newest guess as to when we could see Frank Nazar get his first NHL call-up, of course, he did play in 3 NHL games at the end of last year, so it won't be his NHL debut, but his first call-up from the Rockford IceHogs, I'd anticipate about a month, Blackhawks fans. I think early to mid-January, because quite honestly, even though Anders Sorensen, still got to get used to that, is coming with a new mentality and is coming in with a new style and going to try to push the pace a bit more, as I'll talk about here in just a second. At the end of the day, I don't know if the Blackhawks have the weapons on hand to go and actually make a big difference compared to when Luke Richardson was the head coach. So ultimately, because of that, we'll see what winds up happening with Frank Nazar. I think just because of these clear deficiencies with the roster and Nazar's consistency, should that keep up, it's going to wind up leading to him being called up to the NHL level earlier than that original path. There are my thoughts, though, on a crazy handful of roster moves made by the Blackhawks following their 5th consecutive loss on Saturday afternoon. And coming up in just a moment here, Blackhawks fans, I'll get into that loss to the Jets as I'll talk about Anders Sorensen's first game as the interim head coach and expectations for him moving forward. But first, I got to talk to you all about a new sponsor here on the Locked On Podcast Network, which is Mint Mobile. And I love a great deal as much as the next guy, but I'm not going to crawl through a bed of hot coals just to save a few bucks. It's got to be easy. So when Mint Mobile said it was easy to get wireless for $15 a month with the purchase of a 3-month plan, I called them out on it, but turns out it really is that easy. And to get started, go to mintmobile.com/LockedOnNHL. There, you'll see that right now, all 3-month plans are only $15 a month, including the new unlimited plan. And all plans come with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. Go and find out how easy it is to switch to Mint Mobile, and you'll get 3 months of premium wireless service for just $15 a month. Again, that's mintmobile.com/LockedOnNHL to cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/LockedOnNHL. Disclaimer, $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for more details. I also got to talk to you all real quick about Game Time. Hockey season, of course, has taken over, and it feels so good to get back down to the United Center. And I'm sure many of you Blackhawks fans who are watching or listening to this right now feel the same way that I did before the start of the season, and that's why I got to talk to you all about Game Time. And Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks, which makes getting tickets to your favorite live events, not just hockey games, even easier. And Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. And I personally have used Game Time for probably close to 10 years now at this point, since I was in high school, because it's always been the cheapest and easiest way for me to purchase all of my tickets, whether I'm going to see the Blackhawks, the Cubs, or any team in any city. And I also love how they provide images from every seat in the house, so you know exactly what to expect before you make a purchase and before you arrive. I highly recommend you all go and download the Game Time app right now, and when you do, create an account and use the code LOCKEDONNHL in all caps for $20 off to the sporting events, concerts, or theaters near you. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Game Time. Back here on the Locked On Blackhawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Real quick, just wanted to say thank you to everyone for making Locked On Blackhawks your very first listen here to start off your day. For your second listen, you got to be sure to go and check out the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast so that you can become a fantasy hockey expert and get the edge over your league mates with daily tips from Steal and Flip. And you can easily find the link to Locked On Fantasy Hockey down in the description, or simply search on YouTube and wherever you may be listening to your podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Segment 2, Anders Sorensen's tenure, his start to his tenure as Blackhawks interim head coach did not get off to the best start, as the Blackhawks fell 4-2 to the Winnipeg Jets on Saturday in a game that looked too similar to the previous 26 contests under Luke Richardson's leadership. The Blackhawks got off to a really good start. They scored 2 goals in the opening 20 minutes to take a 2-1 advantage after the first period, but weren't able to drum up anything offensively the rest of the way, and watched the Jets get better and more confident period after period. However, I do want to give Sorensen a little bit of slack here, as it was a very tough first game behind the bench for him, as the Jets, third best team in the NHL right now in terms of point percentage, have been at the top or right near the top through the opening 25 to 30 games here this season, and also are known for being one of the best defensive teams in all of the NHL. It was going to be hard to see the changes that Anders Sorensen made. It was going to be hard to see them occur immediately, and quite honestly, I do think that's still going to be the case here through the Blackhawks' 3-game road trip out east, as they'll be taking on the New York Rangers, who, yes, have struggled, but still a good defensive team. We know what Igor Shesterkin provides in net. He's going to be getting the start here tonight, and then the Blackhawks also will be taking on the New York Islanders on Thursday and the New Jersey Devils on Saturday. But as far as what we saw from Sorensen's team in his first game as interim head coach, there were a couple of things that I liked that I wanted to be sure to bring up here real quick. First and foremost, what was notable was 2 goals in the opening 20 minutes from defensemen. I mean, the Blackhawks have not gotten goal scoring whatsoever out of their blue liners this year. Alex Vlasic, Seth Jones, who of course is out right now due to a foot injury, are the only defensemen to have found the back of the net twice. And that was because Vlasic scored his second goal in as many games to kick off the scoring for the Blackhawks on Saturday. Alec Martinez, as I referenced during segment 1, finally scored his first goal as a member of the Blackhawks. Altogether, though, just love to see the defensemen more involved on the offensive side of things and just being more aggressive to help out this desperate Blackhawks offense. That's what we need more of, defensemen pinching in, jumping up in the rush to help give this team legitimate scoring opportunities and odd man chances. So I like to see that the defensemen had a little bit of a change in mentality. And also, on the flip end of that, yes, the Jets controlled the game. Yes, they had the puck more than the Blackhawks. I don't think that was going to surprise anyone considering where these two teams are at in the standings. But it still didn't feel like the more aggressive mindset from the defensemen and a little bit of a change in structure, as I'll get to here in just a moment, didn't lead to defensive blunders by the Blackhawks. There were some lacking moments in coverage. Mark Scheifele's game winner in the third period was a clear miscommunication by the Blackhawks in the defensive zone, but it still wasn't like a pitiful defensive performance, especially when they were going through some goaltender issues. Arvid Soderblom had to come in off of the bench cold midway through the game and wound up holding his own, and the defense in front of him, I thought, wasn't giving up point-blank chance after point-blank chance. So even though there was a difference in mentality and we got more offensive production out of the defensemen in one game under Anders Sorensen than we've seen all year, can't imagine with the Blackhawks. I didn't go and look at the box scores, but I don't think there's been another game this year in which the Blackhawks have gotten 2 goals from their defensemen. That was noticeable right away in the opening 20 minutes. Also, what was noticeable was the Blackhawks switched up to a 2-1-2 forecheck, which is kind of allowed the F2, the second forward in that position, to be a little bit more aggressive. It helps push the pace and get the team up the ice a little bit faster, I think, and that seemed to help out the offense a little bit, at least in the first half of the game. Again, going to be tough to see a lot of these changes when you're going up against such a good defensive bunch, but I do like the Blackhawks switched up their strategy because clearly what they were going with wasn't working, and altogether, they just need to play with that style, be more aggressive in transition, because the dump and chase has been absolutely abysmal for them this year. One thing I also like, we didn't really see it in the game, but I like that this was the first thing Anders Sorensen had his team doing when he stepped in as interim head coach in practice, just working on tape-to-tape passes. This Blackhawks team has been a horrible passing team all year long, and clearly is something they need to work on, which is pretty sad to say at the NHL level. But even when they do get opportunities to break out through the neutral zone or get something set up in the offensive zone, like half the time it feels like those situations get wiped out because of a bad pass. So I like that that's something that Anders Sorensen has been focusing on thus far. But as far as what his expectations are for the remainder of the season as the Blackhawks interim coach, quite honestly, they don't really differ from his priorities, which he mentioned when he was first introduced during his presser. Number one expectation is for him to wake up Connor Bedard, though, and it was another sleepy performance out of Bedard's line on Saturday against Winnipeg. And there's been some tinkering in practice. Looks like Ilya Mikheyev has been skating with Bedard. At least he was in practice yesterday. Not 100% sure if they're going to roll together on the top line. I know a lot of people were making a stink about Mikheyev being on the top line, but quite honestly, Blackhawks fans, I don't hate it. I think that makes a lot more sense than having Joey Anderson on his wing earlier on in the year, because listen, Teuvo Teravainen and Philip Kurashev right now, they're just not doing enough. They can't get Connor Bedard the puck. And there's a problem when they don't have the speed or the skill to be lugging the puck up the ice, lugging the mail into the offensive zone and creating something for Connor Bedard. Neither nor can they go into the offensive zone and win puck battles to get Connor Bedard more touches. They're doing absolutely nothing in terms of helping Bedard out right now. And honestly, I've seen enough of Kurashev and Teravainen on that top line. Taylor Hall, I think, has kind of been guilty of the same thing, right? Like the puck falls off his stick or he makes bad passes in the neutral zone. They're all being passengers right now, and their lack of creativity, lack of consistency is absolutely killing this Blackhawks offense. So with waking up Connor Bedard being the expectation and the priority for Anders Sorensen, I understand going with someone like Ilya Mikheyev, who has good wheels. I've mentioned that on the show a couple of times. Now, does he have the offensive game to go with it? No, and he's clearly lacking the finishing touch. But what I do like from Mikheyev these last few games, he's been able to enter the offensive zone and make a heads-up play to get his teammates the puck. Making good passes, using his speed to enter the offensive zone and create offensively. Now, can we rely on Ilya Mikheyev to do that consistently? I think that is absolutely a concern. But there is at least some reasoning behind moving him up on the top line, because he's done a good job of making plays and recognizing where his teammates are with open space and getting them the puck to create prime scoring opportunities. That's more than Philip Kurashev and Teuvo Teravainen can say for a majority of the year. So I don't mind seeing Ilya Mikheyev up on the top line, but ultimately it's going to have to be Lukas Reichel up there at some point. Either with, listen, if you have to move Reichel and Craig Smith up there with Connor Bedard, two guys who have been moving very well together, I got to give Craig Smith a lot of credit because his wheels have been very underrated. He has been one of the better skaters on this Blackhawks team, which I know really isn't saying a lot, but I think he's worked well with Lukas Reichel because they both can play with a little bit of pace. Pat Maroon meshes with that line really well because he's just so good with his body down low, knows how to shield off defenders and hold on to the puck. They're the only line that can legitimately cycle in the offensive zone. And listen, priority number one is getting Connor Bedard going. I don't care if it has to be Pat Maroon and Lukas Reichel. Lukas Reichel or Craig Smith. You got to get Connor Bedard opportunities with guys who can get him the puck. It's going to have to be Lukas Reichel up there at some point in time, more than just one or two rushes during the middle of the game. No, I think you're legitimately going to have to give Lukas Reichel an opportunity with Connor Bedard at some point because his style of play can get Connor Bedard the puck, and who he's been playing with recently have not done a good enough job at that. And with this being Anders Sorensen's number one priority, he's got to make sure that that's got to happen here sometime soon. Also, expectations for Anders Sorensen altogether, just play with more pace, even if that means the defense getting a little bit worse. You ultimately have to. You have to create more off of the rush. This is not a dump and chase team, and I think that's going to go better with the 2-1-2 style that Anders Sorensen wants to play. You got to get away from the dump and chase. You got to create more off the rush. You got to play with more pace, even if that means getting a little bit worse on the defensive side of things. So be it, because if this team is going to lose games, we can't be lacking the development out of our key young players as well. Also, interesting, I do wonder if for Anders Sorensen's expectations to fully be on display in terms of wanting to play more pace, wanting to get more help from the defensemen, wanting to be more aggressive out there. I just wonder if the Blackhawks are lacking the pieces to do that. The roster, I mean, golly, I don't know how many more games I can continue to sit here and say Teuvo Teravainen, Philip Kurashev, Tyler Bertuzzi, all these guys, Taylor Hall, they're not getting the job done right here, right now. At some point, it might just become a reality, probably already is a reality for a lot of us, that this group around Connor Bedard just simply isn't good enough, even if there is going to be a change in mentality from behind the bench. So I do, again, wonder if that leads into Frank Nazar getting called up a little bit earlier than originally the front office would have liked to. I do wonder if that leads to Kevin Korchinski. I don't think this is going to be the case, but I do wonder if at some point Kevin Korchinski continues to play well in Rockford with his wheels defensively. The Blackhawks are just really missing that. I do wonder if Anders Sorensen, because he is a developmental guy, I'm sure there are conversations happening with Kyle Davidson. If things continue to go the way they've been going with this group, even if Anders Sorensen is trying to get them to change and play with more pace, there might just come a point where he says, I don't have the pieces to play properly with this style. I do wonder if that leads to a move from the front office in terms of some sort of trade, or someone from Rockford getting called up like a Frank Nazar a little earlier than we expected. But there are some of the expectations and what I saw from Anders Sorensen's first game behind the bench as Blackhawks interim head coach. Before I wrap things up for today's episode here, Blackhawks fans, still have to get into my weekly Mailbag Monday fan segment. But first, I do got to talk to you all about the fine folks over at FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action in the second half of the regular season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and win $150 in bonus bets if that first $5 bet wins. And the FanDuel Sportsbook app now gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So that when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you also happen to place your bets. And not only are our Chicago Blackhawks in the midst of a losing streak, but so are our Chicago Bears. Did not get the interim head coaching boost against the San Francisco 49ers on Sunday. I'm not going to recommend going and betting on the Chicago Bears. Feels like the smarter thing to do would be to fade the Chicago Bears throughout the second half of the NFL regular season. If that sounds good to you, make sure to go and check out FanDuel.com right now. And if you're not already a member, create an account, and that way you'll have a chance to win $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So never waste a hunch and go and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the National Football League. All right, segment 3, before I close out today's episode, still got to get into my weekly Mailbag Monday fan segment. And again, a reminder, if you're watching this right here, right now, or listening to this, be sure to go and drop your Blackhawks related question down below in the comment section. If you're tuning in through an audio platform, you can hit me up in the review section, or you can also DM me on any one of my social media channels, or even email lockedonblackhawks@gmail.com. Real good turnout in terms of social media Blackhawks related questions. Need more from some of you YouTube viewers. Make sure to drop your Blackhawks related question down below in the comment section. And I got a lot of late submissions, by the way, on X. So apologies if I don't get to all of them. Can't have the show run too long. But any questions I don't get to today, I'll make sure to stash them for this time next week. First question comes from Isaac Guerrero 8873 on YouTube, who asked, regarding Nazar, he played wing at World Juniors last year. Also, didn't he play at least some wing at Michigan last year? There's a lot of current rostered Hawks you mentioned that are wingers and are playing center. Is Nazar projected to be an NHL winger or a center? Ideally, the Blackhawks would like to play him at the center ice position, I think, because of his speed, because of his 200-foot game, the motor that he plays with. He cares about the defensive side of things. I think if things were to be ideal, Frank Nazar would play the center ice position. However, I do think he has that ability to play the wing. And I know, Isaac, you referenced him playing the wing at the World Juniors last year. Yes, he did that from time to time. I honestly think he played center ice most of his sophomore year at Michigan. But he has been able to play the wing. However, with Rockford, they've been playing him at the center ice position, and that just kind of looks like the plan. However, down the road, when you kind of mix and match things and you think about, well, Sasha Boisvert is a center, Oliver Moore is a center, Ryan Green, who's a prospect, I believe, is a bottom six guy, middle six guy, but I think he could be a center iceman at the NHL level. You wonder how all of these centers are going to fit in. And having too many centers, it's a good issue to have. It's the exact opposite of what the Blackhawks have at the NHL level right now. They don't have enough centers. So even if they have to move Frank Nazar to the wing, I think he has the capability to do that. And I do think at some point, with how they have to mix and match the lines and the roster one day down the road, if everything goes well and all of these guys develop properly, I do think it is a question about whether they could move Frank Nazar to the wing. Ultimately, though, like I said, it never hurts for Frank Nazar to be a 200-foot center in case they need him to play that position. And based on how they've utilized him in Rockford, I think that's where they want him developing. But I think there is a case to be made on either side of it, especially if he finds good chemistry with Connor Bedard, who's been missing a line mate since he's been at the NHL level with the Blackhawks. That could force the Blackhawks to ultimately make a decision, but a little too early to say for sure. I think we're just going to have to wait and see how Nazar looks during his first significant NHL stint. Next question comes from Murray McCourt, who asked, thoughts on Phil Kurashev for Morgan Frost? Who says no? Thoughts on Phil Kurashev for Morgan Frost? Who says no? Anyone need to add a draft pick? Two young guys with upside that need a change of scenery. Could be a win-win if we had to add a third or fourth. I would do it. Interesting kind of trade hypothetical thrown out here. Kurashev, both players are 25 years old. Kurashev, of course, really struggling, only 5 points in 24 games so far this year, but did have 54 points, 18 goals, and 36 assists last season, and is still an RFA at the end of the year, so some team control there. Morgan Frost at the same point basically in his career, 25 years old, 10 points in 24 games this year, so the production's been a little bit better, but has never been a 50-point player in the NHL like Philip Kurashev was last year. Frost did have 40 points in back-to-back years, though, prior to this one, where the consistency has kind of eluded him again. Former first-round pick, though, is Frost, whereas Kurashev is a fourth-rounder. I think Frost, even though that really doesn't matter at this point, he does undoubtedly have the higher ceiling of the two should he find his footing in another situation. He is, I think, more of a true center iceman than Philip Kurashev is as well, so I think that would probably make Morgan Frost the more valuable player of the two here. And I think if you were to say a 1v1 trade, the Flyers would be the ones saying no, in my opinion, there. You're giving up a center iceman, even though you feel he does need to change of scenery for a winger whose consistency has been down this year. I think Frost has the higher upside between the two, the more sought-after player. And if I would have to guess, the Philadelphia Flyers are probably trying to get a second-round pick for Morgan Frost, if I had to imagine. If they do ultimately wind up parting ways with him, it would probably be for a second. I do wonder, though, I think the Flyers would consider Philip Kurashev in a third for Morgan Frost. Ultimately, though, I don't really think Philip Kurashev moves the needle for the Philadelphia Flyers. Personally, don't think that would be a deal that winds up getting done just for Philip Kurashev. It doesn't really change where the Philadelphia Flyers are at. It feels like that's a move that they would make if they have no choices left with Morgan Frost. And I don't think they're backed against a wall in terms of where they're at with him right here, right now. So I think the Flyers would probably be the team to say no, but I do think that is a really interesting hypothetical trade. Next question comes from Wold P94, who emailed in the podcast and asked, do you think the Blackhawks will trade Arvid Soderblom when Laurent Brossoit returns? And quite honestly, that ties into the next question I got from HockeyFan98, who asked, who do you think is more likely to get traded of the three goalies, since Soderblom is going to become ineligible to be waiver exempt? Mrazek, Soderblom, or Brossoit? Which would you prefer to trade and why? And yes, for anyone who isn't aware, Arvid Soderblom, I think, is now 2 games away from hitting that 60 games played threshold that would no longer make him waivers exempt to be sent to the AHL level. And I know Mrazek's out right now. Brossoit hasn't returned or made his first appearance with the Blackhawks so far this season due to injury, but you got to figure at some point in probably February, late January-ish, both goaltenders, Brossoit and Mrazek, are going to be healthy, and that's going to put the Hawks in a very precarious situation because with Soderblom taking a great step this year compared to what we've seen out of him in the last couple of seasons, the Blackhawks really don't think they'd like to lose Arvid Soderblom for nothing in return through waivers. And I think if they sent him through waivers, one team would be interested enough in order to make a claim for him, especially at under $1 million, still has team control at the end of the year. That just feels like an unavoidable situation for the Blackhawks at this point in time. So I do wonder if they can consider trading Arvid Soderblom whenever Brossoit and Mrazek are healthy at the same point in time. Maybe they tried to trade Petr Mrazek. Maybe they tried to trade Laurent Brossoit, but both players still have 1 year left on their current deal. After the end of this year, Mrazek signed on at $4.5 million. And with his groin injury, with his age, I don't think another team would be willing to pay him that or would be giving up really anything noteworthy for the Blackhawks to get in return. And I don't even think they'd want to chomp off, retain some of that salary in order to move him. I don't think they'd be that desperate to move him that they'd take up one of those retained salary spots for a whole nother year. And I don't think they'd want to do that with Laurent Brossoit, who, I mean, right around the trade deadline, he'll be just getting off to a start as a member of the Blackhawks. And with Arvid Soderblom kind of being this weird in-betweener where they have higher hopes for Drew Commesso. I'm sure even though his start to his college campaign hasn't been great, I'm sure they have higher hopes for Adam Guyan. They have to ask themselves where they really see Arvid Soderblom kind of fitting into this long term. Ultimately, they're going to trade whichever goaltender puts them in the best situation, whichever trade gets them the best return. But trading Mrazek or Brossoit, I think, would be a lot more complicated and would put them in a precarious situation with Drew Commesso probably not being ready to be an NHL backup next year. They probably want both Mrazek and Brossoit in between the pipes, especially if they want to be better next year as a team, right? There's a lot of variables that go into this decision of what to decide with these goaltenders. But one thing is clear. Soderblom is going to play 60 games with the Blackhawks before Laurent Brossoit returns, and whenever Brossoit is healthy, Soderblom is the clear odd man out at the NHL level, regardless of how he plays because of these two guys being under contract. We'll see what winds up happening in terms of the decision that Kyle Davidson makes, but it is going to be chaos involving the Blackhawks goaltender situation at some point here in the season. Last question that I have on today's show. As I mentioned, I know I'm not getting to all of them, but I'll make sure to stash them for this time next week. Last question comes from Dubit. I cannot pronounce this. I apologize. DUBITARETEZATA on X, who asked, Should they sign Wyatt Kaiser to a long-term contract like they did with Vlasic? Vlasic, of course, signed a 6-year deal last April at $4.6 million. That'll keep him here with the Blackhawks till the end of the 29-30 season. Wyatt Kaiser, 1 year younger than Alex Vlasic, who's 23. Kaiser is 22. Will be a restricted free agent at the end of this year, and I'll tell you what, he has been one of the unsung heroes of this Blackhawks team. Wyatt Kaiser hasn't been talked about much because the offense hasn't been there, but quietly he has been stellar on the defensive side of things for being a first full-year NHLer, and compared to what we saw from him in the defensive zone last year. He looks like a completely different player, much more confident, much more stable. I've been really impressed with Wyatt Kaiser, and I do wonder if the Blackhawks front office feels the same way. Now, we're only 27 games into the year. I don't think they want to get ahead of themselves, but I do wonder if Kaiser continues along this line of play, he could get an extension like we saw Alex Vlasic get at the end of the year. Not going to be 6 years, not going to be $4.6 million, but maybe something around 3 years at $1.5 to $2 million. Probably not 2 because Kaiser doesn't provide much offensively, but it could be a nice little bridge deal if he keeps up this style of play through the end of the year. Again, really happy with what we've seen out of number 44, Wyatt Kaiser, on the back end. Much more confident, much more sturdy. That keeps up. I think he could be looking at a contract extension like we saw from Alex Vlasic last April. All right, that is going to wrap up today's beefy episode of Locked On Blackhawks. Thank you to everyone who stuck with me up until the very end. Be sure to go and follow Locked On Blackhawks for free right now, wherever you may be listening to your podcast, and to go and subscribe to Locked On Blackhawks on YouTube. That way you can get the latest episode as soon as it becomes available each and every day. As always, I'm your host, Jack Bushman. Go and give me a follow on X at Jack Bushman2, and be sure to check out my strictly Blackhawks account at Talkin' Hockey. That way you can get all of the latest Blackhawks news and updates. So until tomorrow's episode, everyone, go Hawks. Hopefully they don't get crushed by the Rangers. I'll be recapping tomorrow's game, and we'll be getting into a Blackhawks prospect update on tomorrow's show. Until then, everyone, stay warm. Good weather here in the Chicagoland area. I'll see you next time on the Locked On Blackhawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.